Welcome to Daybreak Australia. I'm Haidi Stroud-Watts in Sydney. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens. The top stories this hour: a mixed start ahead for Asian stocks. Investors are bracing for another busy week for central bank activity and earnings headlined by AI darling Nvidia. Also ahead, rescue teams searching for Iran's president and foreign minister after their helicopter crashes in dense fog, with conditions described as extremely difficult.
And I'm Stephen Engel in Taipei, where Lai Ching-te is about to be sworn in as president. We'll have live reaction and analysis as Lai takes his place at the heart of the geopolitical confrontation, if you want to call it that, or rivalry. That's a better way of putting it, between the global superpowers, China and the United States.
Absolutely. Tension, regardless of how you characterise that relationship, right? So plenty of politics, plenty of economic data, as well as central bank decisions on tap for investors to contend with at the start of this week. This is a picture as we set up for the start of cash trading here in Sydney. We're looking a little bit higher. Stocks are set to climb more broadly across the region. US equities, if you recall, on Friday, notching that fresh record high amid those resilient corporate earnings. Of course, some of that reassuring data from on the inflation front was also still at play in the Friday session. We also had some moves by Beijing to shore up China's property market. We'll get more on that in just a moment. But of course, there are some analysts that say that these housing rescue sort of policy measures are too small to make a meaningful difference. We'll have to see how the open shapes up. But A50 China futures looking pretty optimistic at this point. Take a look at how US futures are tracking at the moment. We're also, of course, watching commodities as well as energy markets, given some of these uncertainties over the Middle East, with Iran's leader and his foreign minister missing after the helicopter crash. We'll bring you more details on that in just a moment. Brent crude is holding pretty steady at the moment, just under that $84 a barrel level. We did see really a weekly gain for oil, with that supply outlook and inflation setting the tone going into the end of last week, but a little bit more uncertainty as we start out this week. As I mentioned at the top, rescue teams in Iran are searching for President Ebrahim Raisi after the helicopter he was travelling in crashed. State media reporting that dense fog in the region is making conditions extremely difficult. For more, let's bring Bloomberg's Michael Heath. So, Mike, what do we know?
Well, he was in President Raisi was in Azerbaijan, which is obviously the neighbouring country, and was flying back after a ceremony there on the border. Azerbaijan, actually, there's the country of Azerbaijan, and then in northwestern Iran is also called Azerbaijan because they were once one people. But it's a very mountainous area, dense fog, a lot of rain there, sort of as the pictures are showing, and his helicopter is believed to have crashed. Foreign Minister was on it as well. There was reports that there were 9 people in the helicopter. There were other senior officials, more regional officials. But at this stage, basically rescue teams are trying to get into a pretty inaccessible area. So we're sort of just waiting to hear there. President Raisi, he was elected in 2021 in a vote where a lot of people abstained. It had the lowest turnout since the Islamic Republic was declared in 1979. He's very, very conservative, very popular with the Supreme Leader, and some people had said he was being groomed to be the next Supreme Leader. Though he's president, he actually isn't the true power in Iran, that is with the Supreme Leader. If it turns out that the worst has happened and he has died, what will happen is the vice president will first vice president will step in for about 50 days in a temporary position, and a group of guardians will organise elections to replace him. But at this stage, we really don't have a lot more information. I mean, just because of the regional tensions at the moment, there's obviously going to be a lot of speculation around as well. But it does seem at this stage like an accident in dense fog in a mountainous area.
So, as you say, should we sort of expect the situation to progress in the worst case scenario? Do we expect policy continuity?
You'd suspect so, Heidi. I mean, Iran, there was some fairly significant protests there in 2022. There was the death of a young girl who was arrested by the morality police, and she died in custody, which led to a lot of upheaval there. It's a very young population. They're really not terribly happy with the government. Obviously, there's severe sanctions in Iran. A lot of young people looking for work there, kind of thing. So the government is sort of in holding down the population phase. So the likelihood of them risking of sort of a more moderate person seems unlikely, particularly with the Gaza war going on, particularly with the sort of axis of resistance, as they call it, with Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen as well. That a hardliner would be probably the most logical replacement there, but again, we just have to wait and see.
Netanyahu will be watching this very closely, obviously seen as the biggest threat and challenge to Israel. It's quite a bit of chaos domestically there too.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting time, isn't it? We sort of shifted to politics now from war at this stage. Benny Gantz, one of the opposition leaders, has delivered an ultimatum to Netanyahu with a series of demands and saying that if they're not met within a couple of weeks, that he will leave the war cabinet. The defence minister, who's also part of that cabinet, is actually from Netanyahu's party, also criticised the Prime Minister last week, saying that there's no plan for Gaza after the war ends. And basically this sort of triumvirate that had worked very well initially in the war has basically broken down in recent weeks. And the difficulty here is that on one hand, that sort of doesn't look great for Netanyahu, but he still holds a majority in the parliament there. He just has to basically get through to July, when there'll be a recess in Israel's parliament, and that sort of will mean that there can't be elections really held until 2025. So it looks like he will be okay. I mean, he's much wilier, he's much more experienced than Gantz is.
Thanks, Michael Heath there. You can, of course, get a lot more on what's happening in the Middle East, the other stories you need to know to get your day going in today's edition of Daybreak. Terminal subscribers can find that at Daybreak. It's also available on the mobile in the Bloomberg Anywhere app. Sticking with politics, and Lai Ching-te is set to be sworn in as Taiwan's new president in a few hours. His inauguration address will be closely scrutinised for signs of how he plans to navigate the island's complex relationship with the US and China. Our Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel is in Taipei for the day and joins us now. So, Steve, closely scrutinised, closely watched, as we said. What will you be watching out for?
Yeah, we'll be watching out, obviously, for Lai Ching-te's tone and any comments about how his new administration will run Taiwan. Obviously, we've had the previous two terms under, he was the vice president and Tsai Ing-wen was the DPP president, which, of course, has more of a pro-independent stance than, of course, the KMT. And they've rattled the nerves in Beijing, no doubt. So this election, obviously, was won by Lai Ching-te of the DPP, but it was a three-horse race, which sort of weakened Lai Ching-te's mandate coming into the office. He got about 40% of the votes, so he didn't have that strong mandate. The KMT did not fare that well either, 33.5%, but it was that third-party candidate, Ko Wen-je of the TPP, winning 26.5% of the votes. So those two opposition candidates won far more votes than Lai Ching-te did, and the KMT took one seat more in the legislative yuan than the ruling DPP. So that is going to set up potentially for a contentious term for the new president, who will be sworn in later this morning, Lai Ching-te. So that sort of sets up the polarization within this island nation of 24, 25 million people. And how does that relate to policy? I expect Lai Ching-te to talk about continuity, about reaffirming the status quo on cross-strait relations. But keep in mind, during the last 8 years of Tsai Ing-wen's rule, essentially Taiwan became a bit more isolated and also became more of a flashpoint in cross-strait relations, as the United States also sort of amped up its rhetoric and its support for Taiwan. Keep in mind, since 2016, Taiwan lost 5 Central American governments as diplomatic relations. And on the day of the election victory for Lai Ching-te, they also lost the Pacific Island nation of Nauru. So that's 2 that they've lost in the Asia Pacific, including Solomon Islands. They just have 12 diplomatic relations with 12 countries around the world, and we're talking small countries. The king of Eswatini is here, also the prime minister of Belize, the president of Paraguay will be here, also the leaders of the Pacific Island nations of Marshall Islands, Palau, and others from Central America. But it's a dwindling collection of countries that recognize Taiwan over Beijing. So that is something as well to stem the tide, to stem the dominoes trickling down again over the next 5 years or next 4 years of this first term, potentially first term of Lai Ching-te.
Steve, there's also the issue of the power being amassed by the KMT, right? And we got another glimpse of just how sort of colourful and active domestic politics can be on Friday.
That's right. There was a bit of a scuffle in the legislative yuan. The KMT clearly going to try to take advantage of its one-seat advantage in the legislative yuan. They won 53 seats in the 113-member body. One more than the DPP at 51. The TPP, the third party, secured 8, and there are also 2 independents. Those 2 independents, though, are said to be more KMT leaning. So what we're hearing is that the KMT will try to use that advantage to push through this bill that is being discussed, and that's what this scuffle was all about. They want to put the pressure on Lai Ching-te in his opening days by forcing a annual State of the Nation address directly to the members of the legislative yuan. They also want to have a separate annual meeting between the president and the members of the legislative yuan. And if he is deemed by them to, if the leader, Lai Ching-te, is deemed to be lying, that could be a jailable offense. And that is something, of course, the DPP has said is the process of this rushed bill is unconstitutional. Keep in mind as well, while the new president and the new vice president, Xiaobi Kim, are going to be sworn in today, several months after that January election victory. The legislative yuan, the new members of the parliament, took office in February, I believe it was. So they've had some time to build up their strategy and see how potentially they could, at least in the KMT, could undermine the new president, who did come in with a much less of a mandate than the previous president over the last 8 years, Tsai Ing-wen. So it'll be a very interesting first day for Lai Ching-te, and we'll have to see what tone he strikes. The front pages of all the newspapers are all about this. Front page, back page, everything is about this inauguration. And this is an interesting one, too. Yesterday, Lai Ching-te and his running mate, the new vice president, Xiaobi Kim, went shrimp fishing with the heads of states of those visiting, 7 heads of states of those diplomatic partners. And it's kind of symbolic, in an island nation that is fairly small with a dwindling number of diplomatic partners. They went shrimp fishing. So I'll just leave it at that.
Our Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel there in Taipei. We'll get more analysis when it comes to Taipei and out of Taipei throughout the course of the day. Lai Ching-te taking his oath of office. These voices are coming up at the times on your screen. Another big political story that we're watching very closely. China is investigating its Minister for Agriculture and Rural Affairs for what it calls serious violations of the law. Tang Renzian is the latest high-level official to be investigated for alleged wrongdoing. He was appointed Agriculture Minister in December 2020. President Xi Jinping has spearheaded a sweeping anti-corruption campaign since 2012, ensnaring dozens of Communist Party officials. More to come here on Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg. Let's take a quick look at the week ahead, and it is another big few days for central banks across the region. Decisions out of New Zealand, Indonesia and South Korea. Bloomberg Economics sees holds across the board as policymakers watchful very much on inflation. The Fed and the RBA also releasing their minutes from those latest meetings. Later on Monday, Chinese banks will probably keep their loan prime rate steady for a third straight month. This after last week's PBOC hold. CPI readings also due out of Japan, Singapore and Malaysia. Meanwhile, Nvidia is headlining the week's earnings releases, and Bloomberg Intelligence expects the world's most valuable chip maker to repeat another solid beat thanks to surging AI demand. China's EV makers will also release their results on the heels of Tesla's bruising price cuts and tariff hikes from the US. Let's bring our next guest, Fred Newman, who's the Chief Asia Economist and co-head of Global Research Asia at HSBC, joining us from our Hong Kong studio. Fred, always great to chat with you. And of course, the sort of overlay to all of this is central bank policy. We're expecting holds across the board in terms of the ones meeting this week. I do wonder the kind of build-up of data that we've had, particularly when it comes to the US. Are you convinced that steady and significant progress is being made when it comes to inflation?
Well, it's not yet clear that we're really out of the woods with inflation. Core inflation is still running very high in the U.S. and some other Asian economies. And so central bankers would like to ease monetary policy. Of course, they're worried about keeping policy too tight for too long. But the data doesn't necessarily give the opening just yet. So in Asia, we have 3 central banks meeting this week, and all of them will probably stay on hold. And the market will be watching very, very closely at those nuances at the messaging, trying to discern what they're thinking about next steps ahead.
Are you concerned about stagflation as still being a risk? Jay Powell kind of shrugged that off, but certainly I know for Japan, that's one of the things that you're watching.
It's certainly still a theme because we know price pressures are sticky. There's a risk of a slowdown in economic growth. And we even wouldn't rule out that maybe some central banks may need to hike interest rates. At least that's still on the table. Certainly one of the Fed speakers last week indicated that a hike is still possible. Here in Asia, of course, the Central Bank of Japan may need to raise monetary tighten policy, raise interest rates because inflation is just getting away from them. Growth was slow. We had a fairly poor first quarter GDP number, and the high inflation is not helping consumer confidence. So central bankers really have their work cut out for them here, and stagflation certainly is a bit of a theme in Japan at the moment.
And of course, this time around, there's no sort of heavy lifting, if you will, being done from China. What do you make of these latest efforts to try and support the property sector? We had a report out suggesting that, direct purchases from local governments was going to be something they are considering. Do we need more of a big bang from there?
Well, the market certainly took it well on Friday because there's a sense, there's greater urgency in Beijing that they're really thinking about dialing up the response. Having said that, the numbers in terms of funding being put behind this, it's still not quite where it probably needs to be to really have a quick fix. So what's encouraging is that we have new tools to address this issue, but I think the market is still looking for what exactly are the funding numbers behind this? How much muscle is the central government going to put behind these policies? Are they going to look to local governments to fund this, or are they going to make more money available centrally? And I think the latter will be important really to get us going again. So watch this space. Hopefully more money's coming, but in itself probably just not enough to really be the end of the policy response.
What is the structural future and the outlook for China, do you think? I mean, there is a sense that the slower for longer new normal is something that investors need to become accustomed to.
Well, certainly it's lower for longer in the sense that we're not going to go back to these extraordinary growth rates of decades past. The economy is just too mature for that. Having said that, we're probably a bit of a low point at the moment. We do think there is some improvement coming through, not just in terms of real GDP growth, but nominal GDP growth as well, because, of course, that matters for corporate revenues, that matters for profitability, that matters for investor sentiment just as much as real GDP growth does. So we do think there's some improvement coming through here, but remember, you're not going to get much headway unless you see the property market really turn the corner, and we are not just there yet. Even the measures on Friday will only get us a little bit closer to that, but not yet over the line on property. So fixed property, that's the first priority, and then the economy should do a lot better overall.
It's clear going into November that we're seeing tariffs and these sort of punitive trade actions as being kind of more part of the mainstream toolkit, right? This is not something that's just saved for the former President Trump that was showcased kind of in his presidency. What does that mean in terms of risks for Asia as a region, but particularly for China?
Well, for China, of course, the risk is that these trade restrictions are going to be dialed up even before the elections and possibly after as well. So there's a real risk here that we see exports to the United States from China slow. But a key risk, I think, is also that as much as when the U.S. puts up trade barriers, it redirects exports to other parts of the world, forcing other economies like Europe then to also raise trade restrictions. And I think from China's perspective, perspective, that escalation to other economies would be a key risk. Note, though, that there are also costs for all sides. Restricting China from global access is going to hurt consumers in many parts of the world. It's going to raise inflation pressures at the margin, at least in the U.S. and then possibly Europe as well. So everybody's bearing the cost to some extent, but certainly China will be watching which economies are going to follow the U.S. Because we can maybe live with less demand from the U.S., but we can't really live with the rest of the world shutting China off as well.
The other big kind of question mark is over energy inflation, right, and what we see out of the Middle East. And of course, it's already just a contentious year for all of the conflict and tension that's going on. Now, of course, we're reporting the latest when it comes to Iran's president and foreign minister missing after this helicopter crash. We're hearing that the conditions for the rescue are very difficult there as well. The expectation is, to a large extent, policy continuity, sort of either way there. But how much is the risk of these tensions across that region dialed up, and the pass-through to potentially that, a big impact on inflation through the energy market?
Of course, it's possibly a very tragic event in Iran, and it would add to a bit of uncertainty. And of course, we're watching very closely how oil markets are reacting. Luckily, we had oil prices kind of retreating a little bit in the last few weeks. But there is, of course, the risk that we're going to see another spike. And that is really the last thing we need right now in the global economy, as central banks are trying to lower interest rates, that if we get a big oil price spike, that would push back rate cuts even further, that would weigh on economic growth. And so I think there's a big risk here that with policy uncertainty emanating from Iran or elsewhere, that we're going to see another energy price spike. And that's, of course, going to keep inflation higher, is going to depress consumer spending, particularly in Asia, which is very, very much dependent on imports from the Middle East, but also in Europe, which is increasingly dependent on the Middle East, having reduced its import from Russia. And so we watch this very, very closely. And of course, what's happening in Iran at the moment just adds an extra layer of uncertainty to the entire Middle Eastern complex.
Fred, always great to chat with you. Fred Newman, who's the Chief Asia Economist and Co-Head of Global Research Asia at HSBC. More to come here on Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg. Lai Ching-te is set to be sworn in as Taiwan's new president in a few hours. His inauguration address will be closely watched for signs of how he plans to navigate the island's complex relationship with the US and China. Our Chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel, is in Taipei, standing by with our next guest. Steve.
Yeah, we're previewing, of course, later this morning. Lai Ching-te will be sworn in as the next president of Taiwan, and we're very pleased to have our first guest of our coverage this day. That's Cynthia Wu. She is a TPP member and former vice president candidate, along with your running mate, Ke Wen-je of the Taiwan People's Party. Thanks so much for coming in to Bloomberg Television, our little studio here in Sydney district of Taipei. What kind of tone do you hope to hear from Lai Ching-te? It was obviously a very heated campaign between three parties. You were one of the three parties as well as the vice president candidate. Is there a tone that he can strike to kind of bring Taiwan together at a time of polarization?
I think bringing Taiwan together is definitely going to be a key message, because there's no other way he could be pushing for any of the reforms he's to seek, because the DPP is in a slightly weakened position with only 51 seats in legislature. So I hope it's a message of consensus building and bringing Taiwan together at a time when there's a lot of global upheaval, but also many domestic challenges as well.
Do you think that polarization in Parliament, though, can kind of weaken his mandate on all the big issues that the president of Taiwan has to do, including cross-strait relations?
Absolutely. I think it will be a difficult negotiating process for this new president. as he's trying to navigate. It'll be very different from President Tsai Ing-wen, where she had majority of the House.
Yes. So what priorities would you like to hear from him? You took on sort of a platform of some of the economic issues and reform as well, whether it's pension reform, but also some issues with the bills that you initiated when you were a member of parliament, 17 bills, I believe, including a sovereign wealth fund, which you proposed for Taiwan to use its a portion of the more than $500 billion in FX reserves that Taiwan has to put it at play and also win more influence abroad with that money, right?
Yes.
So what kind of priorities on the economic front would you really spearhead it? Would you like to see the ruling DPP take up?
I think in terms of this government's KPI, as I like to call it, because I come originally from private sector, key performance indicators, I would love to see more focus on foreign direct investment and efforts for international connectivity, including the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And so also, for example, one of the initiatives of mine, global minimum tax. Because right now, Taiwan hasn't joined the league of this new tax reform that would make us allow Taiwan to facilitate to become one of the regional hubs here in Asia, whether it's for supply chain or if it's for tax purposes. And in the world where it's China plus one, Taiwan plus one, Taiwan needs to accelerate change to create more jobs, because after all, we can't only be known for semiconductors. And the bottom line is 60% of our economy is actually in the service sector. And so the ongoing concern for the average citizen would be around housing, affordable housing, around inflation, and the fact, putting in an average citizen's view, is the costs just go up and up. And my salary has not increased at all. So I think all of the legislators across all parties would also have to focus on that. And I think a couple of other issues, including industry concerns. So 2025, Taiwan also will have the third plant of our nuclear power plant be phased out.
Yeah, you say Lai needs to address this pretty quickly.
Yes,
the energy mix.
Energy mix, and it's an issue that AmCham and ECCT, the American and European Chambers of Commerce, have mentioned again and again. And so again, when I talked about international connectivity, it's about Taiwan's competitiveness, creating more jobs, securing our economy, and safeguarding our citizens' future. We'll need to get industry enough of a stable energy supply. So this nuclear issue needs to be focused on. I mean, the world is now talking about hydro and nuclear, and Taiwan's Taipower, our state-owned power company, is 80% fossil fuels. LNG and also coal. So that's something that really needs to be addressed. And finally, I think around our aging population, because I come from the insurance industry originally, 2025 is when Taiwan will meet the super aged economy, which means that 20% of our 23 million people will be over 65 years old. And so what it means is that
pension reform.
Pension reform. But I'm happy to say that it's one thing that I think President Lai can harvest rather quickly, because when I was co-chair of the Health, Environment and Labor Committee last autumn, shortly before I became VP candidate for TPP, I chaired a session around pension reform, and there seems to be a huge consensus already, crossbench, around increasing defined contribution opportunities. And so that could be quickly done, and again, to secure the pension future of our country. And 2028 is when our labor pension will go bankrupt as well. So those are the issues that he would be faced with right away.
Fairly quickly, on the Sovereign Wealth Fund, since we're talking about a big pile of money here, one of the largest pools.
Fourth largest in the world.
Absolutely.
Foreign reserve.
From my understandings, you got about 64 of the support from 64 members of the legislative yuan out of the 113. Where does it go from here? You're no longer in the legislative yuan. And there are 8 seats now of your party compared to 53 by KMT, 52 by DPP. Can they pick it up and move it forward to reality?
I'm very excited to say that both KMT and TPP have put forth my original bill again to the table, which is actually amending 2 articles of the Central Bank Act. And that would allow for 10% of its $570 billion US dollars to be put aside for a sovereign wealth fund for purely foreign investments. And again, that will help with Taiwan's interconnectivity and be engaged with other economies and to earn, have better returns, because right now our central bank's return is below inflation.
Absolutely. Very, very quickly, what are your political ambitions? What's next for you? Are you going to run for legislative yuan again? Will you put yourself on another ticket if you're asked down the road?
I think everything is up for discussion. But for the moment, I'm very happy to meet with legislators across bench at the moment to discuss various bills on the topics I've mentioned around carbon tax, global minimum tax, sovereign wealth fund, pension reform, and the like.
You're not going away. Cynthia Wu, thanks so much for your time on Bloomberg Television. Your debut on Bloomberg Television. Please come back and talk to us anytime.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Okay, guys, back to you, our ongoing coverage of the inauguration of Lai Ching-te as the next president of Taiwan.
Stephen Angle there, our chief North Asia correspondent there on the ground in Taipei. And of course, we'll be bringing you Lai Ching-te's inauguration as Taiwan's 14th president as it happens. More analysis also with our guests in Taipei coming up at those times on your screen. Let's take a look at our markets doing, particularly when it comes to commodities after the big run-up that we've had recently. Avril.
Yeah, Heidi, we've seen commodities on quite the tear, and the Bloomberg gauge is hovering at the highest level since January 2023. And of course, a big component of this is crude prices. And even as we keep a close eye on the geopolitics of it all, I think the recent driver has really been the supply, the inflation outlook. And we also see how diesel and gasoline, it's trading at pretty healthy premiums to Brent, but even that has come off recently. So that could put continued pressure on the global benchmark for crude. But also, we saw, remember last week, sort of metals mayhem and copper prices, in London, almost trading at that record there after the short squeeze. But we're keeping a close eye as well among the metals complex on iron ore prices. It's, hovering at the highest level in about 2 weeks, and all this is against the backdrop of optimism for Chinese authorities putting a floor on the real estate market. So those are among the commodities we're watching, Heidi.
Sources say the world's biggest miner, BHP, is considering whether to make an improved bid for Anglo-American before a deadline this week. Our metals and mining reporter Paul-Alain joins us now for more. So, Paul, the deadline is Wednesday at London time, so time is running out. If you're a betting man, do you think they'll get there?
Well, that's a very good question. London time, May 22, that's the deadline. The clock is ticking. But whether BHP can come forward with a third unofficial offer is yet to be seen. Just to recap, they came back to Anglo's board and said US $43 billion. Are you interested? And Anglo hurriedly released the results of a strategic review, which we spoke about last week, and just about everything we spoke about last week came true. They're going to divest their Amplats Platinum business, they're going to divest their Met Coal business, and they're going to divest their De Beers Diamond business, simplifying itself into 3 different areas. Controversially, they are holding on to the Woodsmith polyhalite project, which is a $9 billion fertiliser mine. The market for polyhalite is relatively unknown. It's a commodity that doesn't quite have a market there yet. It's also been a bit of a cash sink. They've been spending about $1 billion a year on it, of course. But they're also going to hold on to their copper assets, which is the reason why BHP is looking to take over Anglo, and they're holding on to their Kumba iron ore business, which came as a little bit of a shock to us. The ball is now very much in the shareholders' court. So a big question that is presenting itself to shareholders in Anglo-American at this stage is whether they trust Anglo's management or whether they trust BHP's management to take the company forward and provide value to them.
Is there a sense that there are some Anglo shareholders who are thinking there's no great rush, right? There's no urgency. If the company is trying to, restructure, focus more on copper assets, could we actually see, that sort of, I guess, the appeal of having a higher valuation down the track and perhaps more interest?
Well, this is it. I mean, the May 22 deadline is either make a formal bid or walk away for 6 months. There is no reason why BHP couldn't come back in 12 months' time and have another look at the business, but of course it runs a big risk in doing that. A simplified Anglo-American could have a much higher valuation, and is BHP willing, this is the big question, is BHP willing to spend a higher premium on Anglo for its copper assets in 6 or 12 months' time? So you're right on the money there.
Metals and mining reporter Paul-Alain Hunt there in Melbourne with the latest as we count down to that Wednesday London time 5 p.m. deadline. We'll be watching for any developments for you. Well, Standard Chartered says it can't comment on a regulatory investigation as it faces pressure to compensate thousands of people who bought complex securities tied to a Chinese stock index that performed badly. Our Asia Stocks reporter Yu Kyung Lee joins us now for more. So Yu Kyung, what do we know about this story and what's the contention here?
Sure. So Standard Chartered Bank Korea was one of the 6 South Korean nationwide commercial banks that had been investigated by South Korean authorities for its mis-selling, of these exotic notes tied to Hang Seng China Enterprises Index. And even though Standard Chartered Bank Korea is one of the top 10 banks, rather smaller banks in South Korea when it comes to among the commercial banks lending, it was one of the top 5 sellers of this Hang Seng China tied exotic notes sold to retail investors. The bank sold about $900 million worth of the product, and it said last month that $100 million has been set as provision. The bank has started compensation process for some of the customers who bought these products and have faced losses as much as 50% because the index that's tied to the structured note has lost almost half of its value since 3 years ago when these notes were sold. But a lot of the customers I spoke to are asking for full recovery of their losses, and if the bank doesn't compensate that, they're threatening the bank that they may move out, they may move their account balances to other banks and cancel their credit cards. So these are some of the loyal customers of the Standard Chartered Bank Korea. So it's definitely a reputational black eye for the bank that has been operating in South Korea for more than a decade, and also could weaken its status in South Korea.
And, South Korea obviously has seen this revival when it comes to foreign inflows, right? And a lot of that's been on the Value Up program, maybe some expectations or hopes that it can replicate what we've seen in Japan with its equity market. What are we seeing in terms of the financial regulator kind of pitching that book in New York?
Yeah, so last week there was this South Korea's charm offensive in order to lure more global funds to show the commitment, the government's commitment in this corporate reform projects. There were concerns from investors because 1 month ago the ruling party has lost parliamentary election, and that has raised concerns about the viability of the corporate reform projects, which require some of the legislative approval in order to have some of the tax incentives that a lot of investors are expecting that would encourage companies to come up with some of the voluntary reforms, such as enhancing shareholder returns and giving more buybacks and cancellation. So on Thursday, Financial Supervisor Service Governor pitched to investors that the government is committed to the reform, and he also gave some timeline about the potential time frame for the short selling ban. He said the authorities will communicate with the markets about when the government plans to do with the short selling ban before the end of June, when we are seeing the current short selling ban expiring. So he said the government will communicate with investors before the end of June what they're going to do with the ban.
Our Asia Stocks reporter Yu Kyung Lee there. More ahead here on Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg. Well, China has begun an anti-dumping investigation into imported POM plastic from the EU, US, Taiwan and Japan. It comes as a state media-affiliated account earlier warned that Beijing was prepared to take countermeasures if the European Union continued its anti-subsidy investigation into Chinese companies. The bloc started a trade investigation into Chinese-made EVs earlier this year. And on that, car makers, including Li Auto and XPeng, will be reporting results this week. So let's bring in our breaking news earnings specialist, Rachel Yeoh, who joins us in Hong Kong. So what are the expectations when it comes to Li Auto and XPeng?
Yeah, so kicking off with XPeng first, we are seeing their first quarter earnings looking quite positive. Its gross margin is set for recovery as well. So XPeng's partnership with Volkswagen and overseas expansion would spur sales and margin recoveries in the second half of the year. And moving on to Li Auto, we are going to see near-term profit margin pressures and lackluster volumes. So they earlier announced price cuts earlier after rival Tesla did as well. But in terms of their first quarter earnings, their adjusted net income may likely see some growth.
And of course, it's a bruisingly challenging time in the sector, right? Particularly when it comes to the price cuts that we've seen from Tesla, the likes of BYD as well. It's an interesting time for Xiaomi to be debuting in EVs. Are we expecting much colour in the earnings that are coming up?
Yeah, we're seeing Xiaomi's burgeoning EV operation already almost at capacity, and Xiaomi is working on a manufacturing expansion and a sport utility vehicle similar to Tesla's Model Y as well. So if the new model launches, it will be like a major step forward for Xiaomi because they have been trying to cut reliance on a volatile smartphone market that's been dominated by global giants. So in terms of its EV business, it may account for mid to high single-digit percentage of its revenue in 2024. But still, moving on to their smartphone segment, first quarter smartphone revenue is expected to see growth as well, and the momentum is expected to continue into the second quarter.
Our breaking news earnings specialist, Rachel Yeoh, there in Hong Kong. Let's take a look at some of the other corporate headlines that we're tracking in. Didi Global's Jean Liu is stepping down from her roles as president and board director at the Chinese ride-hailing giant after almost a decade. According to an internal memo, Liu will become a permanent partner and continue to report to the CEO, Will Chung, as chief people officer. The shift comes as Didi tries to revive growth after a regulatory crackdown. Australian casino operator Star Entertainment says it has received inbound interest from a number of external parties, but has not had any substantive talks. That comes as the AFR reports that a consortium led by Hard Rock Hotel and Casino is considering a bid for Star that would see the firm rebranded and its properties separated from the casino operator. We are just a few minutes away from the start of trading in Sydney, Seoul and Tokyo. This is the setup when it comes to the futures picture. We are seeing that follow the leader, given that we saw Wall Street stocks notching another record high. Earnings have been favourable, of course, as has the direction of the data, suggesting that the Fed might cut sooner than expected. We did see some volatility, of course, last week in terms of how investors have been passing these expectations. Big week for Asia. We've got central bank decisions, including from New Zealand. We're seeing Kiwi stocks up by just about 0.25% in the early part of the trading session. All holds are really expected from Asia central banks. It is also